Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, mystery seekers, musers, conspiracy theorists, interdimensional philosophers, seekers of truth, and last but certainly not least, all of you with confirmation bias. You will find what you're looking for. You're listening to Musings on Mysteries in the Mythical Matrix, a family-friendly podcast where we logically speculate on life. There are going to be some additional trigger warnings beyond our normal trigger warnings for this episode. There's going to be reproductive topics that are discussed, so if you have little ears listening, I would recommend skipping this episode and the Flood series in general. There's going to be talk about reproductive topics in depth that are going to be... We're not going to go into unnecessary detail, but there's going to be references to stuff in that category. It'll make more sense as we go along. And then we are also going to be talking about alcohol addiction and some other topics in that category. So this is not going to be so much of a little ear episode. So use your discretion as you continue along. And then we'll transition to our other disclaimer here. I want to clarify again for this series that we are not trying to prove or disprove Genesis 1 to 11. Right now, I'm focused solely on trying to identify what Genesis is claiming and what is not claiming in the original text. From there, we will address the efficacy of Scripture itself and whether this text has been turned into legend or whether it's a detailed and real account of actual events. This series is meant to flow as a logical argument to analyze the text, and as such, I'm going to work through and address one point at a time. For our proof or disproof of the Bible as a viable source document, refer to our last episode with Harrison Smith. He's beginning to lay out a fantastic logical argument for us to discuss whether the Bible is valid or invalid, and that series will be focused on the proof or disproof of the Bible. Stay tuned as more episodes for that series will be airing within the coming months. Also, want to encourage you, if you're listening on Spotify or any other podcasting platforms, please give us a rating. And if you're listening on YouTube, give us a like and subscribe if you're enjoying the content, and definitely turn on that notification bell as well so you get notification every single time we drop a new episode. We're aiming for Wednesdays in the AM, I'd say every Wednesday, 7, 8, 9 a.m. depending on what time zone you're in. But yeah. With that being said, I am going to kick it off to our resident fish nerd, Trace, for our fish fact for this episode, which will be very relevant since we're going to be talking about a flood.
All right, so it's not really a fish fact, I would say, but I just wanted to bring this up because I've been seeing a good bit about it. So about 2 months ago, there was a weird anomaly picked up off of the coast of South Africa. It's like just a giant blob that appeared on a radar. Showed up and disappeared very quickly. So it was from an app called Ventusky, which is just a meteorological app. It uses a wide variety of databases. So this anomaly said it was about 2,000 miles long and a little over 1,500 miles wide, with over 80-foot waves in that area. Which, for reference, Texas is only 810 miles long and 773 miles wide. So this thing was bigger than Texas right off the coast of South Africa. So, of course you have all the people saying, oh, it's aliens or sea monster or whatever. And one person even said that there's thousands of ships going to the area at the same time. So if this were to happen, you'd have thousands of ships just disappearing off the map, which didn't happen. So the company came out and said it's a glitch, which feels pretty obvious. And it was a model error, which is specifically from a German meteorological service database. It's DMD or something. I can't remember the exact name of it. This also hasn't been the first anomaly or glitch from this app. There was about 2 years ago, there was some radar anomaly that same thing appeared very big and then disappeared over Sweden. So I just wanted to get that out there for people that might be thinking about that. It was just a glitch. It's not aliens. It's normal radar anomaly glitches.
So I'll say two things to that. First off, thank you for putting that in American measurements. We don't use that wimpy feet measurement. We measure in the most obscure nonsense we can imagine. So measurements in Texas, so approximately 1 Texas unit of measurement. Love that right there. Second thing I'll say...
it's 2 Texases even.
Oh, is it? Oh, wow. Okay. Even better. Thank you for that correction. So the other question then is, are we sure this is like a actual like glitch in the radar itself, or could it be possible that somehow it picked up like a plate shift or something on the seafloor?
It's used to measure waves, so I mean, maybe, but I feel like if it was a plate shift, it would kind of be more of an earthquake kind of sensor. But this is just picking up waves, so but it could be.
Okay, fair enough. So it definitely wasn't anything visible on the surface in any way, shape, or form, since we have regular sea traffic going through there. But it's possible there could have been something under the surface that was going on in some capacity, some kind of secondary waves underneath the actual surface of the ocean, or some kind of shifting of plates. Then it's not out of the question, but not necessarily proved in any capacity.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's out of the question, but from what the company said, it was just a modeling error from one of their databases.
I mean, isn't that what the military always says, though? Whenever something happens, they don't want like the truth getting out, right? At least in the shows and movies and everything. It's like, oh yeah, we had a training accident.
Well, we just gotta wait 20 years until they release the files, just like they did saying UFOs exist.
Right, but isn't that like that's been going on since like I want to say like the 50s? Is like, was that when like I think Roswell happened? I was one of the first. So yeah, we might have to wait like 70, 80 years if there's some kind of ongoing investigation. So anyway, we're getting a little
50s and 60s were big UFO territory, but I digress.
Yeah, we're definitely getting off topic there. UFOs will be a topic for the show, but we have a special guest lined up for that in the next couple of months here. So with that being said, I appreciate you addressing that anomaly, Trace. Is there any other fish talk you were wanting to do, or were you wanting to just transition into the episode here?
I'll just throw a quick one out here. Moray eels, they have a secondary jaw inside of their mouth, kind of like the Alien movies, how they have that weird jaw that comes out of their mouth. So eels, like moray eels, have that.
Interesting. Whenever I hear moray eels, I only think about that song, where it's like when the moon hits your eye like a big pizza pie. That's a moray instead of it being love in Italian. That's a moray eel. That's just the first thing that comes to mind for me. All right, we're definitely tangenting off quite a bit for this episode already, and we haven't even really started the content. So I guess let's transition here into Genesis 6. So we're going to be going through, there's 4 chapters of Genesis that are on the flood. These will be, honestly, I'm super excited for this episode and this whole series, if it does turn into a series here. This is going to be, not that the other episodes weren't good content, but this is going to be a bit more relevant, I feel like, for our whole comparative myth exploration. So I'll preface it with that. And then from here, we're going to kick off reading in the ESV, Genesis 6. When man began to multiply on the face of the land and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. Then the Lord God said, My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. They were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. So that's verses 1 through 4 of Genesis 6. So there's quite a lot to unpack here. First thing I'm going to discuss is the sons of God meaning. There's some debate in Christian circles about what this means. Some people read this to mean sons of God as in referring to righteous people, like sons of God, followers of God, those that obey God's commands. That is not consistent with what I believe the Hebrew text is telling us here. It puts great specific emphasis on this in a way that we see listed in the book of Job, actually. So the book of Job, for those of you that aren't familiar, Job is a righteous man, and Satan goes before God and convinces God to test Job in his faith. And when Satan goes before God, it's the wording that's used is it's talking about how the angels went and gave an account before God. But if you look at that's the intent. But if you look at the original Hebrew, it uses this same phrasing, the sons of God. So that's an important thing to note right here off the bat, is that when it's saying the sons of God, this is the euphemism and terminology for angelic beings, if you will. And then next thing I'm going to say here is, and this is getting into the reason here why I wanted to have little ears tune out, is, and they took as their wives any they chose. So this is really sounding like forced marriage here, forced sexual relations. This is kind of starting to sound a little bit like the things that we hear and see about in Greek mythology when we're studying those topics. So, anything you want to add so far? Go for it.
Yeah, I mean, in medieval stories all the time, you have either the knights saving or taking the princess, or the king giving the daughter away. So I want to say it's super uncommon for this stuff to happen in stories. It could just be like old language as well talking about it, so it may not have been that extreme of like, oh well, you're forcing you to be mine, or it could be an exact saying, but
yeah, no, I agree. We have to keep in mind that there's a number of different ways that this phrase, and they took as their wives any they chose. Back in more ancient times, women's rights was not really so much of a thing. Marrying princesses off and everything in the medieval times was very common for political reasons, to maintain good relations with a different nation, because your daughter was married off to that nation. You were less likely to attack them. They were less likely to attack you. You were mixing your bloodlines together. That was kind of the rationale behind that. So it very well could be consensual in some capacity here. It just says that they took as their wives any they chose. And so in my mind, that gives the inclination of forced marriage, and it immediately brings to mind the stuff that we kind of see in Greek mythology and everything specifically. But it doesn't specifically mean that, and I think it definitely would have been a case-by-case scenario here. So reading on to verse 3, the Lord said, "My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh, his days shall be 120 years." So this is when you see God start the biological clock, because before this, as you saw in 2 episodes back now, when we did our Genesis 4, 5, 10, and 11 analysis, man is given a very long time to live on Earth. He's given anywhere from 600 to just about 1,000 years, assuming we're understanding that terminology properly. But here is where there is a distinction made to say that man is only going to live 120 years. And I think that's worth noting, because we don't immediately see Noah and his sons, dying at 120. It's that process that we talked about, I think, a couple episodes back now, where the clock is... Go ahead.
I do want to throw in here, there is one verified person to have lived beyond 120 years, and that's someone named Jeanne Louise Calment. She lived to 122 and died in 1997.
That's interesting. So, yeah, I'm not going to get into the theology here of splitting hairs and trying to necessarily figure that out, but I would wonder, number one, measurement of the date, and number two, I would also wonder if this is talking about the general ballpark of 120 years, like, hey, man's days are going to be numbered to, right around 120 years at the max. Obviously, there can be things that occur that cause someone to pass a lot sooner than that, but yeah, so that's definitely a good side note to have there, to understand that, hey, this isn't literally saying, hey, you will only live 120 years, period, because we don't even see that kicked off and instigated with Noah and his sons. It's kind of a gradual process where that age frame comes down to sit right around 120 years, and even down to like 80, 70 years. And even younger. I think in medieval ages, the average lifespan was like 40 or 50 or something like that. So.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. It's like interesting in that the max is set to 120, but you were lucky to live to 50 in medieval times, and now you're lucky to make it to 90 or 100 in these days.
Yeah. So there'd be a number of ways to read this passage for sure. But I'm not going to, I feel like that kind of veers off into the more theological, and that's not so much our intent, is to dive into that specifically with this flood series. So I'm going to transition here to look at Genesis 4. Okay, so this is where I forgot about this point here I wanted to make. This trace is why I think that this was more forced, and this would have likely been more rape or forced marriage, is because the words for came in that's translated on the ESV. The original word is yabao, and that means to invade. That's a common translation for it. So like came into, it has much more of a forceful connotation to it. And so again, I'm not saying necessarily that's 100%, because that's just kind of my reading of it. I'm not saying I'm 100% right in that. I'm not saying that even if I am right in my reading of that would have been 100% of the time. But I think that's highly likely here. So, yeah, and again, I already hit on what the sons of God means, is that is generally understood in Scripture and in the context that we're given here, and how there's such emphasis put on the text that when the sons of God came into the daughters of man and they bore children to them, this is talking about angelic beings mixing their DNA with humans, which is a pretty wild thing to think about. So last thing I'll note here is I've kind of already alluded to it. Greek mythology, this idea, this concept of gods, lowercase g gods, beings with great power coming down and making women conceive and bear children. This starts to sound very similar to the drama of like Hercules and all of these other, how Zeus was so sex crazed and everything. We start to see some overlaps here. And this is where the comparative mythology can kind of start picking up a little bit, because I think as we study myth, we're going to see these concepts pop up more than just in Greek mythology. But Greek mythology is kind of the most in the forefront of people's minds here. So that's the one that I'm going to most readily reference. Anything else you want to interject, Trace, before we move on to the next couple of verses here?
No, we can move on.
All right. So I'm going to read Genesis 6:5 to 6:8. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So the Lord said, I will blot out man, whom I have created from the face of the land, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens, for I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. So, the implication of these verses here, there's a lot of evil that's clearly going on. I mean, if you have, righteous people in God's eyes marrying unrighteous people, you see that happening with Israel a lot, and you see that kind of, you could argue that that's littered throughout history. So I wouldn't say, again, looking at the sons of God terminology, that's weird. That kind of prefaces this idea where God says, hey, mankind is so wicked. I think the wickedness that God sees here is this genetic experimentation, if you will, of mixing your DNA with humans and angels. I think that's what he's seeing here. And then it also emphasizes that the thoughts of his heart, of man's heart, was only evil continually. So that not only is there this deep depravity going on, but that mankind is sinking so much into evil and just being despicable in God's eyes that God says, you know what, I gave man this free will and everything, but this is not what I made. This is not what I created. And so that's what we see when it says the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. I've seen someone try to argue that God sinned in making mankind, and that the meaning here for sorry is repentance in terms of repenting from sin. That's not what's being said here in any way, shape, or form. What is being said here is that God is outside of time, as we've kind of explored and everything from the Christian perspective, but that God will experience things in the moment to be able to relate to us. And so God, being outside of time, is experiencing things in this moment, and he's seeing the depravity of things in this moment, and he's looking back to when he gave that free will and seeing like how it all plays out, and it breaks his heart in the moment. And so this isn't saying that God did some sin in creating man. It didn't mean he made a mistake. It's the word here is nahem. It's translated as a changing of mind or relenting, often in context specifically to God. So it means that he's kind of changing his mind in this sense, and that's kind of what kickstarts the flood. But yeah, anything you want to interject on that so far, Trace?
I do just want to ask, because you mentioned humans mixing with angels. Now, where are these angels coming from? Are these like fallen angels?
So this would definitely be fallen angels, because this falls outside of God's design and is something that God never accepts. So these would definitely be fallen angels, and we'll explore this one, Trace, a bit later when we get into our study of Satan specifically and the Book of Enoch, because the Book of Enoch, although it's not accepted in Christian circles, it explains a lot more about the Nephilim, and it has a lot more to bring to the table. It kind of goes into details of like the specific names of the fallen angels that come down and like the relations that they have and everything. Not like gory details or anything like that, but like just like, hey, you know, they come down and they do like they marry and all this stuff, if my memory serves me right. And so it's an important addition. There's clarity in Revelation that talks about when Satan fell from heaven, that he brought down angels with him. And I think that what that's referring to in Revelation, because it's kind of a recap of things that had happened in 12, in Revelations 12, I believe. That's my reading of it. I think that the Book of Enoch kind of sheds some light on that. So to circle back real quick to say my last thought on the God making a mistake, you have to read Scripture in context. You can't just put your own meanings or ideas into one word without context. God is described as sinless. That's the whole premise of the Bible. And so you can't just be like, oh, look, it says God was sorry, therefore he sinned and made a mistake. No, that is, you're doing all sorts of assumptions. You're ignoring context there. You're ignoring the broader understanding. You have to explore the text and what this specific word means across texts, because this isn't the only time we see this word in reference to God apologizing. I believe there's at least one or two other times where we see this. Another thing I'm going to touch on as well, and this is going to build off into some other interesting discussions in the future. There's a belief that was prevalent in the day of Jesus and amongst the Jews. It only became rejected by the church as a whole in around the 3rd century. I think it was Emperor Constantine of Rome that did away with this belief within the church. But there is this belief that demons were the disembodied spirits of Nephilim. They were the disembodied spirits of these angel-human mixes, and that's why they have such a loathing for humanity that you see throughout the later Old Testament and into the New Testament. I believe this idea is also proposed in the Book of Enoch as well, which is another reason why I want to dive into that. Anything you want to interject there, Trace?
No, I wouldn't say so. I didn't really have any significant thoughts there.
Okay. So let's see here. Kind of lost my place for a second. Okay, so one last thing I'm going to touch on. There's a vague implication here that if the fallen angels were doing this with humankind, that they would have likely been doing this with animals as well. That they would have been taking and having sexual relations with not only humans but animals. And again, Greek mythology is kind of what's in the forefront of most people's minds, and we'll explore other myths as we do our deep dive studies. But I'm going to contrast it to Greek here, where you have all sorts of different creatures like fauns and centaurs and all of these weird mixes of creatures that are just, I don't even know how to describe it. I don't want to say they don't make sense, but they're just very specific. And you could certainly argue it's artistic depiction and ideas. But if you look at it with that implication here as well, that not only did they take humans, but they took animals and did what they wanted to them, you start to see a potential root for where these ideas of all of these mythological beings came from. That maybe some of them weren't quite myth, maybe some of them were actually indeed genetic hybrids. Anything you want to add there?
That would really throw a wrench in evolution stuff.
Well, right, and we're going to talk about this one after we wrap up the Flood series, and in between our series with Harrison, we're going to discuss holes in the standard model and other theories of evolution that are becoming more and more prominent that actually involve hybridization ideas instead of just standard evolution trees. And I think that that's a much more viable argument than saying, over millions and billions of years, through mutations and everything. But yeah, it definitely throws a wrench in. But the thing is when we make these assumptions from the standard model, like it's fine if you want to believe that, but when you make these assumptions from the standard model that we evolved, you automatically exclude this in your mind. You hear these kind of ideas and it's like, oh, no, that can't be true. The Bible is clearly wrong. And it's like, well, even if you think the Bible, and even if you're absolutely convinced in your mind and you have absolute evidence that the Bible is a mythological account, okay, fine. But you still are ignoring the potential ideas and exploring these ideas and concepts, because there are true accounts in the Bible. Whether you want to say it's every single one or if it's just, a sprinkling throughout. And there's no way to really know to prove or disprove this. And so we owe it that exploration from a scientific perspective to say, hey, was there genetic experimentation with, that's another thing too I actually just thought of. Think about like a lot of alien abductions and everything, Trace. Think about how like it often centers around like people being probed a lot and everything, and they're explored and they're often, returned naked and all of these things. And so you've got to wonder about connections there. And we'll explore that in greater depth when we talk about UFOs, because there's some good theories on UFOs we're really going to explore and deep dive into. But a lot of people out there, when they study UFOs, they, initially when I studied UFOs too, like I set out as a nuts and bolts. So it's a hardcore craft. The more you explore it, the more it becomes kind of clear that this is not of this world, not just in the sense of coming from another universe. This is not of this world in terms of there's something supernatural here in a spiritual sense almost. And so you can kind of start tying these ideas together as well to be like, hey, there's stuff that had happened in the past, and that's a very likely conclusion to make. But again, I don't want to jump too far ahead. I'm starting to kind of connect these dots so that our listeners can hear where we're planning to go, and I can plant these seeds and then answer these questions in, the coming months. I'm going to then transition here into verse 9. Verse 9 is going to kind of give me a good finishing hook to this discussion and my case here, if you will, that these Nephilim were half human, half angelic beings. These are the generations of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. So the phrase Noah walked with God definitely refers to Noah having a close relationship with God. But I want to discuss the word for blameless in verse 9 here. So Genesis 6:9, because this is going to be an important point. The word for blameless is tamim. It's the same word that's used throughout Scripture for genetic and physical purity for like animals being brought to sacrifice. So later on in the Old Testament, I'm just going to give a little bit of background because this is relevant for this point. Later on in the Old Testament, there were a lot of guidelines for specific type of animals that God would require for sacrifices, and they had to not have physical deformities or any kind of mutations or anything like that. And that word to indicate that is the same word that's used here to describe Noah and his generations. So when it's saying Noah was blameless in all of his generations, looking at it in context of what we've just discussed and the ideas that we've already imposed, the ideas that already existed at Jesus' time, the ideas suggested by the book of Enoch, all of these other connections from myth that we've been making, almost certainly means that Noah's genetic line was untainted by these fallen angels, these sons of God, that Noah's genetic line was pure in terms of not having Nephilim. So, what do you think about that, Trace?
I think the only thing I really wanted to add in here is when you're talking about the abductions, there is a lot of cases where they talk about like them trying to make an alien human hybrid. So that would also potentially correlate.
Yeah, absolutely. And, for those that aren't sold on the UFO idea, that's fine. Humor us on this here. I'll give a little snippet here, but humor us on this discussion. And actually, we've been going for about half an hour here, and we have not taken one ad break, so I apologize. We're going to roll probably 3 ads here, and we will be right back after this break. All right, we are back, ladies and gentlemen, mystery seekers, musers, conspiracy theorists, all of you out there listening from your spaceships above. We're going to continue our conversation here, talking about UFOs briefly. So before the break, I had said, humor us, but I want to give a little bit of explanation as to why I think that there's at least some validity and some capacity to at least some of these UFO reports. And I know I'm qualifying a lot here, but there's a reason for that. It's a really broad topic. The biggest thing for me is the criteria of embarrassment when it comes to UFOs. So the criteria of embarrassment is used specifically in historical documents, but it's relevant in modern discussion as well. It's when embarrassing facts are included in something that you wouldn't want to necessarily make up. It's a way that is used in theological texts and even in general historical texts to verify and prove or disprove certain texts as being either actual accounts or as just being fabrications by the author. And I would say that the UFO subject you can definitely argue for the UFO phenomenon in a general sense from the criteria of embarrassment, because, there isn't much gain that comes from saying you have a UFO sighting. More times than not, when you look into the UFO accounts, people are shunned by their communities. They aren't rich. They're seen as kooks and wackos and everything like that. They are rejected. They are outcast. They are ostracized. And so for it to be a publicity stunt, the majority of people that claim to have UFO sightings don't even often come public with it. So that is worth noting here, that I'm not going to make a whole argument for the UFO case, but while we're discussing it and tying it in here, for those of you that might not be sold on the UFO phenomenon, I want to at least give you that tidbit of evidence here to give a little bit more credence to the idea, and then we'll follow back up on it when we actually get into our UFO series. But I really don't feel like I have to sell those that are conspiracy theorists of our listeners on the UFO topic. They're probably already wholehearted believers and wearing tinfoil hats, perhaps. Who knows? So I'm going to skip over. I'll read through. Verse 10, and Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. In verse 11, now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. And God saw the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. And here again, you see the word for flesh, and I don't think I looked this one up in the Interlinear Hebrew, but the word choice for flesh in the English also mean, you would take that meaning to be, a physical, tangible, biological meaning as well. The word for corrupted here actually can mean destroyed, and so another way to read this would be, instead of corrupted their way, that they had destroyed their way on the earth. And again, I think that's that might be talking about broader sin, from a biblical perspective, but I think specifically what's being talked about here is that genetic mixing. So a sub-note here, because this is a big theory I'm seeing floating around, is that the mixing Sumerian mythology here, and we'll get into Sumerian mythology, but it's the idea that these two main beings, Enki and Enlil, generated the flood, and that's who we're seeing talked about in this account here, and that there's all these weird nuances in it and everything. And the idea there is that they're potentially space aliens sitting up in a ship, and one decides to wipe out humanity and the other one decides to save humanity somehow. And then there's all this drama and everything goes on. And we'll get into this and we'll explore this in greater depth. I'm just kind of giving a really quick summary. So we're about to read about the flood. There's going to be a lot of details that we're going to see here that are going to be very extreme. And so if we're looking at a theory of like space aliens causing a flood, how would space aliens cause a flood? Because we're going to see extreme planetary turmoil occur. There are a lot better ways that if you had the capacity to generate a global flood, there are a lot better ways. I'm sure your technology would be advanced enough that you could destroy the planet with a lot of different, more powerful weapons than just a flood. Because of the amount of energy you would have to generate to cause the shifts and everything that we see here, that'll start to be described in Genesis 7. But just bear that in mind as we read the rest of Genesis 7 and 8 and 9, and we kind of start talking about all of the geological shiftings and everything else that's going on as well. So that being said, we'll carry on here. And God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence through them. Behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Make yourself an ark of gopher wood. Make rooms in the ark and cover it inside and out with pitch. This is how you are to make it. The length of the ark is 300 cubits, its breadth is 50 cubits, and its height is 30 cubits. Make a roof for the ark and finish it to a cubit above, and set the door of the ark in its side. Make it with lower, second, and third decks. For behold, I will bring a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh, in which is the breath of life under heaven. Everything that is on the earth shall die. And I'll stop there because I'm starting to get ahead of myself a little bit. Trace, any thoughts that you want to interject here since we're talking about floods and this is your fish nerd world?
Oh, I mean,
You got to enjoy the idea
honestly,
at least a little bit of the whole earth being covered in water. Just from a
yeah,
marine
no,
biology, from a marine biology perspective. I mean, for
definitely.
for humanity and everything else, that kind of sucks. But like for the fish, like, dude,
That must have been very weird for them, I gotta say. Because just imagine that you're the fish, and then all of a sudden you can see all this weird stuff.
all these people drowning around you.
Yeah.
Yeah, it'd definitely be bizarre. So, all right, verse 14, the word for pitch is kofar. It's often translated to mean a ransom, but that the connotation of that is a covering. So what's being annotated here is that it's a covering, for the ark. So the ark's going to be like coated or stained, if you will, in a certain substance. Other thing I'll touch on here, I saw this article a couple days ago, and I thought it was going to be incredibly relevant to this conversation. Bible scholars believe that Noah made over 977 trips to Home Depot during the ark construction. Source for this is Babylon Bee, of course. But that was perfectly timed. So I had to throw that one in there. But verse 15, let's talk about the ark here a little bit. It's a 300 cubits by 50 cubits by 30 cubits. So this is where we start to get into the meat and potatoes of why I think that the Bible, even if you want to dismiss at least certain accounts as myth, this is where we start to get into the reason why at least some of the Bible is worth considering and worth acknowledging. Because even if you completely disbelieve the idea of a global flood, that's fine. The dimensions described here for a craft, it's a 6-to-1 ratio, 300 divided by 50, that's a 6-to-1 ratio. It's the same dimension range that's used by modern cargo ships. Cargo ships will generally use anywhere from a 5-to-1 to 7-to-1 ratio. And then there's other variations out there, of course. But most other craft that you see described or that you see either mentioned in myth or other cultures and everything, nothing would have been seaworthy the way that the ark would have been seaworthy. For example, the Epic of Gilgamesh, that's a perfect one, and I have a huge issue because Billy Carson wants to claim that the Epic of Gilgamesh is the true account of the flood and that Genesis is made up and copied off of it. Well, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the ark is a cube. A cube is going to spin around like a washing machine. You're not going to be able to save animals and people and food and everything else in there. You're going to be on spin cycle for like 40 days. And all the rain is coming down and everything. It's going to be like staying in a washing machine. It's just, that's not going to work. A cube's going to be top heavy. It's not going to last. But a vessel that's described as 300 by 50 cubits by 30 cubits, and I don't know the exact dimensions of the cubit, but that measurement does exist because in Kentucky, there's, from Answers in Genesis, there's the Ark Encounter Project that actually built a live scale ark using the cubit measurement and converting that, to modern dimensions and everything and what that approximately would have been. It's a very massive vessel. And it looks like a bit like a cargo ship, in fact. And so you see a detail like this, and it's like, even if you want to question the idea of a global flood, okay, fine. This is still an accurate description of a seaworthy vessel. There's a lot of effort being put in to describe the specificity of it in comparison to other myths. And that's why I would propose the argument that we see there's validity to the Bible's claims in contrast to these myth stories. But I'm sure Harrison in the coming weeks and months, the next coming episodes, will come on and clarify everything for us in greater detail. But I just kind of wanted to have our listeners start thinking about all of these details that we're seeing in the Bible in contrast to what we're hearing our guests talk about. What do you think, Trace?
I think it's cool that there's these specific dimensions here like that. Anything that gets specific like that is always fun, because then it's not just trying to imagine it. It's like, oh yeah, you can actually more like fathom it more, you know?
Yeah, exactly. Well, that being said, let's finish up Genesis 6 here. Verse 18, but I will establish my covenant with you, talking to Noah, and you shall come into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you. And of every living thing of all flesh you shall bring 2 of every sort into the ark to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female, of the birds according to their kinds, and of the animals according to their kinds, of every creeping thing of the ground according to its kind. 2 of every sort shall come in to you to keep them alive. And also take with you every sort of food that is eaten, and store it up. It shall serve as food for you and for them. Noah did this. He did all that God commanded him. So this is interesting here, because Noah is given a command from God that all life, everything, is to come onto the ark. So that would be everything that we have alive today, everything we see alive today outside of the oceans, all the plants, everything. That would have all come, according to the biblical theory, the biblical claim here in Genesis 6, that would have all come from Noah, which is a very interesting idea. And so yes, that would mean everything. That would even mean dinosaurs would have been on the ark, because God instructed Noah to take everything. And as we've broken down in our chapter by chapter study, there would have been dinosaurs that were created with Adam, and which flies again in the face of that evolutionary idea, which is why this gets so quickly dismissed offhand as being just a mythological account, it's a fable, when in actuality there's interesting ideas here to explore, and that just gets dismissed in the name of science. But we can't use science to prove or disprove the past in the same way we can use science to prove or disprove things like Newton's law and that we can observe in the present. And it's important to bear that in mind when we're exploring these kind of topics and ideas. But
I'd say it's interesting to note that, like, how did they repopulate so much? I mean, you just get one pairing. How do you repopulate the entire Earth with those animals? And if you think about it, wouldn't ocean life be exponentially more profound than life? Because, I mean, maybe the flood did kill some marine life off, but you'd think that there would just be so much more abundance in the ocean.
Well, I mean, there might have been at one point. I mean, the flood I think it was only like 120 days or something like that the waters were actually covering the whole earth before, it receded enough for Noah to be able to dock the ark in the mountains. I could be wrong on that, but we need to take another quick ad break, and then we'll play around with some of these ideas a little bit more after this word from our sponsor. All right, and we are back, ladies and gentlemen, mystery seekers and musers. We were talking about how the earth would have been repopulated after the flood, especially on that kind of a scale. So I would propose, think about the reproductive cycles of things like rabbits and other creatures like that, creatures that would have been ready food for the more carnivorous animal types out there, the apex predators, all of the different hunters. And when you think about it in that perspective, initially, it would have been a really small population of animals and everything getting off of the ark. But, over time, that population would have quickly grown. I mean, think about, animals' lifespans in comparison to our lifespans. Most have a lot shorter lifespan. Most have a lot shorter of a reproductive cycle. I mean, it takes 18 years for a human to reach full maturity by our current scientific standards. They generally considered humans mature at a much younger age in ancient cultures, like think 13, 14, 15 range. But regardless, we have such a long growing period versus like many animal types and everything like dogs. They generally only require a year or so to be able to grow to maturity, to be able to start reproducing. So it's important to bear all that in mind, where yes, there would have initially been very little on the earth in terms of life, but life finds a way, right, Trace? The quote, Jurassic Park, Jeff Goldblum, right there. Mm-hmm. Life finds a way. So yeah, let's play with the other idea here, because we had brought up something too. I don't remember if this was on air or off air, but about what would have happened to the fish in terms of saltwater and freshwater. So why don't you share some thoughts with us on that?
Well, I know the distinction of saltwater and freshwater is very different.
Why don't we start actually too, because I understand the premise, but why don't you understand why don't you explain a little bit more, like, what does it mean for a fish to be saltwater versus a freshwater fish? Like, what does that look like biologically?
Yeah, so saltwater, I may be getting some facts wrong, but I believe they have an organ, it might be their kidney, that is very salt efficient. So they actually get all of their salt that they need from the water, from salt water. Now freshwater fish, they can produce salt themselves very quickly. And also, if you think about it, like, we can't drink salt water because it would actually dehydrate us, because salt would actually take water out of something. That's some exchange. I forget the science behind that, but there's some exchange thing where salt actually extracts water from things. So the saltwater fish, they actually get salt through that, but they're also constantly filtering out the water as well. So if you ever think, can fish get thirsty? Yes and no, because they're always, quote unquote, drinking and then also urinating that out. Now, freshwater fish, they produce the salt themselves, but because of this, they are filtering out water a lot faster. I feel like I'm really screwing all this up. It's been a while since I looked into all of this stuff, but that's more or less the gist of it. Is saltwater fish, they get their salt from the water. Freshwater fish, they produce their own salt. So if you put a saltwater fish into freshwater, they will die because they don't have the salt that they need. If you put a freshwater into saltwater, they'll die because too much salt. Now, there are some fish that they can actually store the salt from the saltwater as they're going into freshwater, like bull sharks, American eels. They go from freshwater to saltwater in their life cycle. So these fish can actually store the salt, and in the case of an eel, they are constantly going through a metamorphosis in their life. So they're always changing, their organs are changing. Now, in terms of this, if the entire Earth is flooded, there would be some intermingling of the saltwater and freshwater. Now, things may have changed. Things may have been different in that time, and eventually, you could argue that fish that got acclimated into freshwater. But I did look it up here to see how saltwater could turn fresh, because at some point there would still have to go from saltwater to freshwater. I mean, we have freshwater everywhere, rivers, lakes, all that stuff. So from what I could find, the natural process of removing salt is desalination. I think I butchered that pronunciation, and that's whenever the water returns to Earth through precipitation, it's freshwater. So, if you look at the flood account, it is raining. It's all rain. So all of that would technically have been freshwater. So maybe there was a lower salinity count. So then it would have been a little easier, because once the water would go down, it would get stuck in pockets like lakes and rivers and such. And those are much lower quantities, so maybe it would have been easier for that salt content to dissipate a lot faster than the entire ocean would. Does that make sense?
I think so. Yeah, that's definitely a lot to digest. So, yeah, you did a good job explaining that. That makes sense to me. I'll kind of re-explain from a different perspective for our listeners, just to add a different dimension to this. So in terms of workout and sports, like us as humans, right? Like, we need electrolytes. Electrolytes are basically just salt and different minerals and stuff that we need. Salt in the human body is actually a necessity for survival, but it's in moderation. You need salt to be able to retain your fluids and everything. If you don't have like enough salt in your body and you just drink water, it'll flush all of the minerals, all of the saline, everything out of you. And that's not good. That's actually a risk for your health. So you have to have a balance of having those minerals and salts and everything. So, we would be kind of more in the category of this saltwater fish then, I think, where you were saying where we get it from our environment and things around us, how they get their saline from their salt from the salt water that they're around. So I understand that part, I think. Yeah. Now there's just so many questions that we have that we just don't have the answers to. There's so many ways that we could go with this question. When God created, was it just salt water? Was it fresh water? Was it a mix? And that's a question that we would have to have right off the bat is, all these different, sea creatures and everything that we have. Are these different variants, where they had to learn to survive in different environments because, maybe when the water burst forth and when the water came down from the heavens, maybe that mixed with salt, and maybe that's what turned the water into salt water versus fresh water. But there's all these questions, and I don't have the answers to these. I'm just throwing out ideas and everything for us to play with and consider in this conversation here. Here's another question for you. Because I think we actually had this conversation a while back. I don't think we fully flushed it out in depth. What happens when you mix a large quantity of salt water with a large quantity of fresh water? Do they stay separated, or do they eventually mix together?
So, yes, it really depends sometimes. There are some instances there may be some videos of which I want to preface this is that this is wrong. But there are some videos that are why doesn't the Atlantic mix with the Pacific? And then there's a clear line of blue water and then murky brown water, and there's a clear line right down the middle. So it's not actually the Atlantic and Pacific. That's the oceans themselves. They're constantly mixing together. Different areas of the ocean will have a mix of salinities and temperatures. And that's just because of surface and underwater currents. It's always mixing and intermingling. But in some cases, freshwater rivers, whenever they come out, they do typically would mix, and that would be a term called brackish water, which is just a mix between fresh and salt. Now, there are some times where the salt water is so dense with salt and whatever else it could be, or maybe I'm getting that backwards. It's the fresh water that's so dense with all the sediments and stuff, they just kind of clash and they don't mix. Now, another case of this would be underwater lakes, which is just like when the water, there's some, I don't know the exact science behind it, but there's some just super dense water that's just sitting in these giant brine pools, pretty much. I think that's the right term. But yeah, did that kind of answer the question there?
So basically the answer is it just kind of depends.
Yeah.
Sometimes it mixes, sometimes it just kind of doesn't.
Yeah, and it all just kind of depends on, a variety of circumstances, but typically they would mix.
Okay. We're due for another quick ad break here. As we take this break, I'm going to throw a thought at you, and then you can answer when we come back here. So I might be wrong here because I'm not looking too far ahead yet. I think the flood occurs for a total of 120. Oh, no, here we go. It says, and on the end of chapter 7, it prevailed on the earth for 150 days. So we have the floodwaters going at the earth for half a year and then starting to recede, I believe, after that. So it would have been a lot longer after that even. With that kind of time period and with massive eruptions of water coming from underneath the earth and from massive rain falling from above, what kind of mixing would you predict that we might see with that? And I'll have you answer that after we come back from this quick break here.
All right, so we are back. I had to do a little digging here. And so I am answering Josiah's question of what would happen over this time frame of the flood. And what I could find is that the ocean wasn't as salty as then. The one verse that mentions the fountains of the deep opening up, this could have added all the salts and minerals to our water that we have in it now, so then it would make the salinity a lot higher. Now the rain would be all fresh water, so it might even that out or so. And you could also argue that what I was saying earlier about the ocean's abundance and why is there, why isn't there a much more abundance in the ocean than there is on land? Well, a lot of this mixing could have resulted in a lot of sea life actually dying out, which, to me makes sense. A lot of the bigger sea animals that could have survived back then, like the megalodon. There's a big fish that I can't remember the name of. It's a real complicated name, but like stuff like ichthyosaurs, all kinds of weird things. They all could have died as a result of these changes in the water salinity and all that stuff. Like I mentioned before with how freshwater and saltwater fish take the water in and all that stuff. And there's a lot more to this conversation if you want. I skimmed through answersingenesis.org, specifically the article of how could fish survive the Genesis flood. So I would encourage that. We're going to put it in the show notes here for further reading if you want to get into it, but it goes super into detail of salinity, temperature, all kinds of stuff. So I'm probably going to read that after we finish recording here today because I'm interested in it myself. But
fish nerd.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. No, absolutely. That's great. Yeah. So it's Answers in Genesis article. We're going to put it in the show notes. I understand that, people come from a wide background. Some people might be rolling their eyes at Answers in Genesis. They do good science. I mean, at the very least, even if you disagree with everything, you owe them a conversation in terms of like hearing what they say. If you're wanting to explore logic and you're wanting to explore the Socratic method in terms of myth, to see if this even would be a viable option from a scientific perspective. It's a question that's worth asking, and that if you want to be consistent with yourself, I think you have to ask. But so let me kind of sum up what you said there, Trace, to make sure I'm understanding and tracking with it here. Is that the premise that they're proposing in that article is more that the salinity of the ocean would have been relatively low, and that the flood and the fountains of the great deep bursting forth, as we're about to read, and I think Genesis 7:11 in the next episode, because we're gonna have to wrap up here pretty quick. But the fountains of the great deep bursting forth would have added salinity to the ocean, so the oceans would not have had as much salinity in them before the flood. So then the proposal here is that there was microevolution that occurred where certain fish kind of managed to adapt to the salinity of the ocean, and they kind of built up a resistance to it, if you will, to kind of throw in that quote of the Princess Bride, resistance to iocane powder kind of thing. Whereas others, they don't have that resistance to it, and they can kind of produce it on their own. I think you said for the freshwater fish. Is that kind of the premise there? Because this is outside of I'm a fish out of water in this conversation, so I just kind of want to make sure I'm understanding everything properly here. But that's kind of the gist of what you're saying and the article is saying, right?
Yeah. I mean, to kind of go front to back, the article even read very scientifically. I mean, it didn't read like I was reading some article just on Bible stuff. To me, from what I skimmed through, it did feel like a very like scientific kind of view on it. And to what you later said, that this less saltier ocean may have created a better environment for change. with this less salty ocean, maybe even some sections of the ocean were saltier than others. So, on, let's say, the northern hemisphere was saltier than the southern. So you'd have all of these more saltwater animals that we see today in the northern hemisphere, and all the freshwater ones more in the southern hemisphere. Now, I'm sure there was a more of a wide variety there. And yeah, maybe some of these bigger prehistoric sea life, they kind of adapted to change. Now, granted, a lot of the prehistoric marine life, like the mosasaur, I don't know, but maybe even like the ichthyosaur and stuff, I think they're technically classified as marine reptiles, so they wouldn't necessarily be breathing the water. But you could then make the same argument for them that why the dinosaurs are extinct, that the same reason these other giant reptiles are now extinct. But that's a whole other conversation there. But yeah, basically what I'm saying is that with these less salty oceans, it could be an explanation that the fish would have adapted easier into each of their respective environments.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. I'll tell you what, since you're planning on reading this article once we finish up with the show, when we record our next episode here, do you want to make that your lead-in fish fact? Do you think that's relevant and worth kind of adding in some final thoughts there and everything as we do our episode, or excuse me, as we do part 2 of our flood series?
I mean, maybe I could look into it and we could discuss the specifics of it.
Okay,
off air, but
yeah, it sounds good. If there's stuff relevant to talk about, we'll bring it up, and if not, we'll pretend like this conversation never happened. And you, as the listener, will find out in about 5 minutes if you're listening after part 2 is already out. For us, it'll be a little bit before we find that out for sure. Well, I think we're gonna close out here shortly. So Trace, why don't you kick us off with your creature fact, and then I think we'll wrap up this episode here. We did not get as far as I wanted to, but that's okay. A lot of fun ideas to talk about. I don't know if it's a fun thing to talk about all of the. It's not a fun thing to talk about the potential brutality of things that happen, especially being sexual in nature and all of that. But definitely a fun idea to play with, this idea of angels and humans mixing together and what that might have meant. So over to you, Trace, for our creature fact, and then I'll close us out.
Yeah, so this is also pretty relevant here. Today I'm going to be talking about the Leviathan from the Bible. I found some quick sources on it, and from what I can tell, there's 3 spots where it's mentioned in the Bible. And I'm sure we can get into this in a later date whenever we dive deeper into it. But
dive deeper, he says, as we're talking about fish facts for a creature fact at the end here.
Yeah, I've been bringing in my fish uprising here the last couple episodes.
Yeah, no kidding. And then you bring up, like, we're trying to wrap up this episode at right about an hour, and then you bring up one of my favorite subjects of the Leviathan. It's like, man, you really,
oh yeah,
you're really handicapping me here. Anyway, I'll let you say what you got to say. I'll try to keep my comments to a minimum, and we'll talk about the Leviathan at a future point for 100% certain.
Yes. So this is very quick notes here. Psalm 74:14. I guess it's mentioned as a multi-headed serpent that was killed by God and given as food. Isaiah 27:1, it's just a serpent and a symbol of Israel's enemies. And in Job 41, it's described as a sea monster and a symbol of power and God. Sorry, I think I messed it up. It's a symbol of power of God, and also just attributing to creation. So just like the behemoth. Now, from my memory, there's a bigger description of it, but that we can get into at a later date.
Yeah, it talks about in Job. I think God says to Job, can you even take a fish hook and catch Leviathan with it, or something to that effect, in Job 41. So yeah, that's definitely an accurate assessment. It's definitely a nod to God's power to be able to create something like Leviathan. And I definitely look forward in the future here to sit down and hear what you think the Leviathan was, because I definitely have my own theories on it. But I don't want to get into that for for the end of this episode here. Maybe we can do that as a secondary creature fact, do another creature fact on the Leviathan. I feel like, it's a little fitting to do more fish facts right now because we're talking about the flood, right? So, excess of water on the earth and, potential excess of marine life. Aside from that would have been, killed in the explosion of water erupting from underneath the earth's crust, as we'll talk about in Genesis 7. So, I feel like these fish facts are relevant here. We're not rocking the boat or anything.
Yeah.
All right. Well, you got any other final thoughts, comments, concessions, confessions, anything like that for us, Trace, before it closes out?
No, I'm just excited to talk more about fish in the next episode.
Of course you are. All right, ladies and gentlemen, mystery seekers, musers, conspiracy theorists, interdimensional philosophers, all of you out there listening from on the earth, below the earth, or above the earth, we thank you for participating with us in this episode. If you want to get a hold of us, you can reach us at m.quad.musings@gmail.com. That's m.quad.musings@gmail.com. You can find us on Instagram and TikTok at m.quad.musings. And you can find us on Facebook, Musings on Mysteries and the Mythical Matrix. Post lots of little clips there and other thoughts and interjections, both from the show and outside of the show. So if you love our content, be sure to check all of that out. And aside from that, thank you for tuning in. We'll see you next episode.